And now, without further ado, let's give a very warm welcome to author Chris Cleave.
Thank you so much. What a lovely introduction. Thank you so much to Toronto Public Library for hosting us. Thank you so much to A Novel Spot bookstore for selling books at the back tonight. They've come a long way. Thank you so much. Means so much to me in particular, but to literature in general, that strong independent booksellers do such incredible work with us all over the country. Thank you. Most of all, thank you to all of you. Thank you so much for coming out. It's an absolute honor and a delight to be back in Toronto. I have loved this visit. I've been all across town these last couple of days, talking with people about my new novel, which is set during the Second World War. And of course, because this is Toronto and because so many Canadians were involved in the Second World War, I've heard some incredible stories. Almost everywhere you go, people bring their own stories to the book. And this afternoon, in a large branch of Indigos just up the road, one of the booksellers sidled up to me and said, do you know that my grandfather and his first cousin were on opposite sides during the Second World War? So his grandfather was in the RCAF. His grandfather's first cousin had signed up also as soon as war was declared on the German side because they had a complicated family. And so the grandfather was flying bombers, the cousin was flying Messerschmitts, and it turned out that they really were exactly on opposite sides in the same combat zones, and they both got through the war. So it was a story with a happy ending, if you like. But everyone had a story about this when I've been all across Toronto, and it's been a real pleasure. I'd love to talk to you about the book tonight. I have a slideshow deployed at enormous technical difficulty. Thank you very much again to the library for getting it up and running. Live and exclusive for the first time in Canada, my slideshow. I hope you'll enjoy it. There's nothing worse than people showing you their family albums. So I'll try to keep it brief and leave lots of time for your questions. Sound good? And I can do a little reading from the book as well, because it's literally just out a week ago. So if anyone has read it, that's way beyond the call of duty. So I'll explain a little bit about the book and how I came to it and leave loads of time for your questions. Sounds fair? This book began when my grandfather, and here's a picture of him. This is my grandfather, David Hill, taken 3 days before the Second World War was declared. He looks like a kid, really, very, very young. He signed up on the first day that war was declared. We didn't know him as a warmongering chap. He was kind, gentle, read us a lot of bedtime stories. He was one of those people who could make anything. He told us a story about his first parachute jump during the war to make us laugh. These were the only war stories he told, the ones to make us laugh. He said, on our first parachute jump, we were very scared, but the sergeant major in the back of the plane cheered us up by saying, well, never mind, lads. If your parachutes don't open, you can just take them back to the packing shed. That was him. He gave me 200 typewritten pages of his life story, his memoir, when he was 86. It was the first time he'd ever really communicated with anyone about the war. And I began to type it up. And at first, I had seen that as a real chore. I didn't realize until later that what he'd given me actually was an incredible gift. It was the first time that he'd felt free to talk about the war. He talked about it, and I was listening. It turned out that he was a very brave person and had been very actively involved in different aspects of the war. I asked him what he thought was the bravest thing that he'd done during the Second World War, and he thought about it very carefully, this kind and loving man. And he said, well, I think the bravest thing that I did during the Second World War was asking your grandmother to marry me. This is her. This is Mary West, my maternal grandmother. If you read Everyone Brave is Forgiven, my main character, my hero in the novel, is called Mary North. So you can see that I spent a really long time trying to make her name as different as possible from my grandmother. This is her. She was an amazing woman. She was a teacher. When my grandfather was deployed to fight in Malta, she stayed behind, and she was a teacher. She taught the children who weren't evacuated from London, and she taught also in the areas around London during the Second World War. Something you need to know about Mary is that before she met my grandfather, 6 weeks before, in fact, she was sitting in a cinema in the East End of London when a bomb came through the roof. This is in 1941, and killed the man who was sitting next to her. And that was the man that she had been planning to marry. She woke up in hospital with 2 pieces of new information. 1, that her fiancé was dead. 2, that the man she'd been planning to marry was already married. His wife was very cross with my grandmother. It turns out that he was a bigamist. In later years, my grandmother referred to that bomb coming through the roof of the cinema as a near miss. That was her. That's all I needed to know to start writing about my grandparents. I in all of my writing, anyway, if you've read any of my previous stuff, you'll know that I'm interested in people not in their capacity as victims, but in their capacity as survivors. All of my stuff is about surviving this mess that we call life. It's at some point guaranteed to reduce everyone to a state of complete heartbreak. There's no one in this room, I will bet you, who hasn't at some point found themselves on the floor with their heart in tiny pieces, thinking, how am I ever going to stand up from this? Well, all of my books are about the fact that guess what people do? People can. And so when people start being funny about dark and serious things, that's when I fall in love with them, and that's when I want to write about them. I wrote about my grandparents not because they'd been ostentatiously brave in the war, but because they had been incredibly brave by being funny about it instead of tragic. This is something that I had. 1,000 pages of letters between my grandparents written during the Second World War. So this is while my grandmother was teaching in London and my grandfather was deployed in the siege of Malta. There are 1,000 pages of them, and I sat down. They're archived from 1939 in folders all the way through to 1945. I read them one by one, and I don't know if any of you have had the experience of being completely addicted to a TV show or to a soap opera. Right? I couldn't stop reading them. I would still find myself at 3 a.m. Reading them. And if you look, I'm just going to go back. Look how young they are. So these are stories about 2 really young people falling in love. I realised that the people who actually fought the war are 20 years younger than the actors in the war movies about the war. You know, they were really young. You read these letters at the beginning, they're so gentle. They're so full of banter. These people are so young and they're so naive. This is a letter from my grandmother to my grandfather. And she's slightly drunk when she's writing this. It turns out, I mean, I've spared her blushes by the handwriting really goes wrong on the flip side of this page. But this is a dress that she's drawn, that she's going to make. Another thing I discovered, they made everything. You know, they didn't have Gap and Topshop. They made their dresses. This is a very natty navy blue and white number that my grandmother made, and we have photographs of her in it. She really did make it. At the beginning of the war, all of the letters are like this. They're young. They're falling in love. It's really rather wonderful. He hasn't been deployed yet. And then later on, the tone changes. So they only met 8 times before they were engaged. On the 9th time, this is the very brave act that my grandfather referred to. He got down on one knee and said to my grandmother, Mary, would you do me the very great honour of becoming my wife? And she looked at him for a very long time, long enough for him to be quite afraid. And then she said, oh, David, what a marvellous idea. Thank you very much, I should love to. And that was it, and they were married. And I'll show you a picture later on of how they ended up. They had a very long and very happy marriage. He was deployed the next day to Malta, after they'd met 9 times. My grandmother, in fact, when they were engaged, had a little ring with 9 stones on it, one for each time that they had met. That's how they'd fallen in love. They'd really fallen, and they'd really gone for it. And then they were separated by the war for 3.5 years, and the only contact they had was these letters, which at the beginning, as I've said, were very naive and full of fun and joy. And reading them, you knew that these characters were going to experience a lot more than they thought they were. And really, this is the theme that you'll see in the novel, in Everyone Brave is Forgiven. We join these 2 lovers at a point where the war has been declared. It has this ominous shadow that it casts over them, but they don't yet know that it isn't just going to be a bundle of laughs. They can't wait to get started at the beginning, but we as the readers know that they're going to grow up very quickly. By the middle of the siege of Malta, my grandfather was really suffering. He was wounded, he was hospitalized. A lot of the letters have this tone. This is very stoical. This is just a cable. He's trying not to worry my grandmother. He says, out of hospital, on leave, cable and mail received, all my love, darling. Actually, he very nearly died. But that wasn't the kind of information that he shared. Later on, some of the letters get really desperate. This is my grandfather writing just after he's heard that his best friend, Geoffrey, has been killed in his Spitfire. He writes, "My sweet and precious darling, I've just heard about Geoffrey and I'm rather stunned, especially as the news has come indirectly by a mention in another letter. Presumably the letter telling me about it is still in transit, so I don't know what happened, and I don't think I want to." Okay, when I read this letter, this is 200 or 300 letters into that big stack I've shown you, chills went up my spine because this was a family story. I knew what had happened actually before my grandfather at this point, when he's writing, knows. Poor Geoffrey was killed in his Spitfire. He wasn't killed in action. He was killed when he overflew his own family's house at very low level for a rare chance to wave hello, and something went wrong and he crashed. My grandfather writes, "All I know is that I've lost something out of my life which only you can hope to replace. Nobody ever had a friend like him, and we did everything together, and I believe at times even thought together. I was afraid that when I fell in love with you and we got engaged, he would feel slighted. But he didn't, and now there's only you. Once we're together again, we must never be parted like this." And so this letter was when I began to write the book. This letter really got my attention because for the first time, all of their humour, all of the little drawings they made for each other, all of the affection that they show, suddenly the tone switches, and this is a man who's desperate. It's a very raw letter, and he's feeling very alone, and he's frightened, and he's writing a letter to the only person that really still means something to him in his life. And that's really where the book began. I went to Malta, I went to all of the places where my grandfather was stationed, and I began to research the book. But before that, I wanted to learn a little bit more about where my grandmother was stationed in London. And so I've got some photos that I think might interest you here, because they're quite unusual. Does everyone know about the evacuation from London at the beginning of the war? Everyone's heads nodding. Good. War was declared, and we evacuated 3 million children from London. Here are some of them. Here are some more. Poor girl on the right doesn't look like she's having much fun yet. These guys are okay. Goodbye Hitler, having a super time on the bus on the way out to the countryside, being evacuated in the first week of the war. Here's a bunch more, having a lovely time in the countryside. Here's the poster. Mothers, send them out of London. Can you imagine that tone being adopted in an advert now? 80% of London families took the government up on this offer. I don't know if that would still happen now, if you would entrust your children to the care of strangers. 80% of people did. This is the poster encouraging people to keep them there. How about that? Isn't it great? Children are safer in the country, leave them there. So I was looking at all of these posters, and I must have looked at 2,000 or 3,000 photos of children being evacuated from London. Something I noticed is that all the children in these photos are white. They are all white, blonde children. Certainly in the posters they are. And I was just thinking, well, actually, that's probably because the huge majority of the London population at that time was white, and that's why any other minority doesn't show up on the photos, because they were statistically insignificant. But because I tried to research things carefully, I thought I would check. And I looked at some street scenes from London in the late 1930s, in the years leading up to the outbreak of war, and this is what I found, that especially in the East End, which was the area that was most heavily bombed during the war, this is a typical street scene. London was a port city, always has been, always been open to the world, had a very large black population since the 1700s. So at the beginning of the Second World War, there were 10,000 black families living in London, and it's incredibly rare to see one black child being evacuated. So I looked at this photo. I looked at it for the longest time. As a novelist, as a storyteller, there's one particular kid in that photo. You might well pick the same one as me. You think, yeah, there's one kid there whose story I would love to know. I don't know, we can come back to that later and see if you've picked the same one as me. I thought I'd just go back and check. Nope, these were all of the evacuation photos. Lots and lots of white children being evacuated. Well, I got to wonder, where did they all come from? Where did these kids come from who I was seeing more and more of in the photos leading up to the war, but fewer of in the evacuation photos? Here's where some of them came from. In London, from the late Victorian times all the way through until way into the 20th century, minstrel shows were one of the most popular forms of light entertainment. This is a poster from the BBC Kentucky Minstrel Show, which was on the radio. Minstrel shows, incidentally, are just a very racist form of parody. The conceit is that they are set in plantations in the southern United States, in this sort of halcyon and imaginary time when slavery existed, but it was fine and people were happy with it, and it was all very jolly and there was a lot of singing. That's essentially the conceit of the shows. The BBC Kentucky Minstrel Show was one of the most popular shows on BBC Radio until the mid-1950s, at which point it was not taken off the BBC in shame. It was transferred to primetime TV, where it became a show called the Black and White Minstrel Show, which lasted on BBC One, 7:30 p.m, prime time, until 1978, a chapter of British history that's been conveniently forgotten. So, lots of the black children in London were there because it was a port city, open to the world and always had been. Lots of them were there because people like this is Carpenter and Hatch, who are a variety act, because of people like this. This is the Tredegar Minstrels. That's not Tredegar in Alabama or Mississippi, that's Tredegar in South Wales. Lots of people were there because people like this is an entertainer called Ken Snake Hips Johnson, who was a big band leader. Lots of the black families were in London because they were involved in minstrel shows and light entertainment and swing bands, and they basically were the entertainment. And they had a lot of children who were not evacuated. And that was because London at that time was very racist, and they had experienced so much racial abuse that when the government offered them to entrust their children to the care of strangers, they were among the 20% of Londoners who are like, no thanks, we'll be okay as we are, thank you. Incidentally, this is Ken Johnson was killed in the Café de Paris in 1941 in London. Bomb came through the roof. That's the aftermath of it. I got to thinking, who are these children? Where are they from? And I wanted to tell their story. So if you read the book, there are two stories. One is the story of Mary, based on my grandmother, who I've told you about, who teaches these children who could not be evacuated from London. That's one strand of the story. Before we forget, this is what London looked like halfway through 1942. It wasn't a joke that these kids needed to be evacuated. So the decision not to evacuate a child, or the decision to stay behind and teach that child, was an incredibly significant thing. It's a story that hasn't been told, and I wanted to tell it. The other half of the book is set in Malta, which is loosely based on my grandfather's experience there. Here's Malta, right in the middle of the Mediterranean. 1,000 miles to the east, you have Alexandria. 1,000 miles to the west, you have Gibraltar. If you controlled Malta, you controlled the airspace around Malta. And if you controlled the airspace around Malta, then you controlled the supplies of weapons and provisions to the armies in North Africa who were fighting at that time. And that was the biggest show in the war at that stage of the war. So everyone wanted a piece of Malta. Britain got there first. Britain garrisoned the island. It was immediately encircled by the Italians and the Germans, who laid siege to it for 3 years. I went to Malta, tried to find out a bit more about the siege. This is what Malta looked like halfway through the siege. Again, this is Valletta, the main city, reduced to rubble by incessant bombing. I spent a long time on the island. I went to all of the places that my grandfather had been stationed. This is what it looks like. Small fields enclosing little grazing areas or places where a thin crop could be raised. It was all rock and rubble walls like this. I became obsessed with them. This is a kind of camouflage that the British garrison was using at the time called rubble painting. Everything was made to look like rock. Here's some more rocks. Some more things made to look like rocks. I began to see this stuff in my sleep. More rocks, more rocky stuff. This is a fort called Fort Gemma in about halfway up Malta, where my grandfather was stationed for a long time, looking out over the plateau. This is the moat of that fort, and now it's overgrown. But in his memoir, and also in my novel, you see the men who are stationed in the fort desperately trying to raise a crop in that moat. That was the only place where they could find enough water and a deep enough soil to try to grow potatoes, to try to feed themselves, because after even the first year of the siege, people were starving. So my grandfather says that something heartbreaking about the siege was that for the first few months, in between each air raid that came in, you would hear all of the dogs barking like crazy. But after the first 6 months of the siege, there was just silence in between the air raids. And that wasn't because the dogs had been killed, it was by the bombs, it was because they'd been eaten. By the end of it, people were eating dogs and cats and pigeons, and people were emaciated, and all of the soldiers were ordered to lie down to save energy when they weren't carrying out orders. It was a desperate time. And so in the novel you see this, you feel that you're there with them, And you see how important was this lifeline of letters between people who were going through that level of desperation and the people back home who meant something to them and were trying to project love and support to them. And there were times in the war when those letters were the only things that were keeping people going. And those letters are the real engine room of the novel. And it's really significant that at a time when they were trying to fight every convoy through, and every pound of cargo that could be taken through was heavily contested and fiercely disputed, it's incredibly significant that they prioritized mail over potatoes. They realized the importance of that. And I've given it that place in the novel. I've given the communication between the people who are fighting and the people who are on the home front primacy in the novel. I spent a lot of time in the military cemeteries. A lot of you will have visited military cemeteries, and you get this really haunting sense of the people who aren't with us now. You know, you look at every empty seat, and that sort of represents people who aren't there. I noticed in the cemeteries in Malta this strange thing. These are some of the names that are actually written in my grandfather's memoir. You know, I went looking for them. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission can help you find names. It was very moving to see these names of friends of my grandfather who hadn't made it through, and to have read them in his handwriting and now to see them carved into this stone. I began to notice something really weird about these graves, which is that there are 6 names here in every grave. Every other military cemetery I've ever visited has 1 headstone per fallen combatant. Here there were 6. So I asked the curator of the graveyard, why is that? And he said, well, you go off and try digging a hole any way you like on this island, and then you'll know. And so I did. And, you know, the whole island is 4 inches of thin topsoil on top of this hard yellow limestone. Incredibly hard to dig through. And that's when it really came home to me that these men were so hungry, so weakened, so desperate that they couldn't even manage to dig 1 hole for each of their fallen friends. And that's when you realize the desperation of that struggle. They were also on rations on the home front. This is what rations looked like. I put myself on these. I thought I would try and stay on World War II home front rations for the whole duration of writing this book. I didn't make it, and I wouldn't recommend it. They were tough to have got through the war on this. This is what a week's worth of rations looked like. You also had whatever vegetables you could get your hands on, and a little bit of flour that isn't pictured here. But here you have 5 glasses of milk. They became a real treat. You have 8 ounces of sugar per person, which was great. I used to eat a spoonful of that every now and then. I didn't know what else to do with it. You also have some stuff that really doesn't have much of a place in the modern diet. Here you have 4.5 ounces of lard every week. I had to look up what it was and what one should do with it. There's also heavy margarine and suet, which was really hard work. 1 egg a week, which became a huge treat. There's a little splodge of jam there. You got a 1 pound pot of jam every 2 months. And so a spoonful of jam became a real treat. And for anyone who's read the book, you will see the significance of that. Being on rations was possible to sustain for me for only 3 months. These people who fought through the war had to be on it for the whole duration of the war and then for years afterwards. And this was also really important for me in the novel, to have gone through that, to have had a slight insight into it. I went through it for three months. My mother and her family were on it for 10 years, and because it didn't finish until way after the war. My mother tells this amazing story about the first time that she saw oranges, and it was in the mid-1950s, and she was in a very poor part of the country, in Lowestoft in East Anglia. And the stevedores on Lowestoft docks had let drop a box of oranges, and it had split open on the dockside. And this was considered sufficiently remarkable so that my mother's whole class was taken out of school to go and look at the oranges, not to eat one, just to look. And my mother, when she told me the story, started to cry. And I said, well, why are you crying? And she said, well, they were just so orange. And that's when I realized that the rationing was not just a rationing of calories. It was a rationing of colour, of joy, of all of pleasure. And so what made these people who fought through the war so brave was not just that they endured, but they endured under conditions that I found really, really hard to imagine. And I think that when you read the novel, you start to feel two things. You feel the, sort of the suffering they had, but also the joy with which they approached each other and helped themselves to get through that. And that's what the book is about. It's about joy. It's about the love that people showed for each other. It's about their sense of humour, which is threaded all the way through the book. And that's what helped them to get through this suffering. I'd like to end on a happy ending. My grandfather did make it through the Siege of Malta. Here he is, back again in 1944. David and Mary, my real-life grandparents, getting married. This is them in Sicily in 1969. And this is them in 2004, on their 60th wedding anniversary. And to your left, that's my own mother, and my eldest, actually. So, this is a story with a happy ending, and I wanted to end it on that for you. Hang on, there should be one more slide that isn't coming up. Oh, well, never mind. We can make do and mend, as they say. There was going to be one more slide of one of their final letters, which I don't need to show you. What I'll do instead is read to you very briefly from the book, so that you can get a feeling of what the book is. But I thought, first of all, I would show you where it came from in my family and how the research worked. If I do that now, and then take time for your questions, is that a good idea? Great, I'll do that. This is taken from the first third of the book, and it's a place where my two lovers, and I think I've introduced them to you as young and naive, and I think you'll see that they are, have just spent the night together for the first time, having fallen in love, and they've gone for a walk in London the next day. Here they are. They sat together on a bench in Trafalgar Square. They watched the grubby pigeons flock. Mary yawned and laid her head on Tom's shoulder. "Are you tired?" he said. "Shall we go back to the flat and sleep?" She said, "I ought to get home. Palmer will fret." "Oh, your dog?" "Yes," she said, and wondered why she had, because in fact Palmer was her butler. The distance between them was nothing, and simultaneously it was so huge that, in the moment, she hadn't found the heart to speak of it. She felt a heavy sadness. "What are you thinking?" he said. "How glad I am. What are you thinking?" Well, he was considering the idea of her having a home, and a pet, and two parents. He hadn't given any thought at all to the concept that she hadn't simply materialized in the world, at 18, in perfect crimson lipstick, laughing, at the exact spatial coordinates and the exact time at which he had first met her. She was so perfectly unique that the idea of her being made ordinary by friends, and worse, by parents, made his chest sink unbearably. He said, "I'm thinking the same. So glad." She kissed him. "I should go." "Oh, yes. Yes, of course." He gave her an anxious look. "What do you suppose you should tell your family?" She stroked his cheek. I shall tell father I stayed overnight with my friend Hilda. I shall tell mother you're lovely. You'll tell her? Oh yes, women share everything. It's the blessing we received when we turned down muscles and moustaches. He squeezed her hand. He said, I'll walk you to the tube. They got up from the bench and they walked back across Trafalgar Square, breaking into a run. They ran, breathless and laughing, with their hands clasped tight while the pigeons clattered up before them. They flocked and swirled and ascended through the city's blanketing cloud, emerging into the sky, a life unmoored from the embattled earth, a thing begun again, looping and wheeling in the Pacific air. Mary held tight to Tom's hand and thought it heartless that the two of them had to stay below in London. She said, I'll be fine from here. He said, I wish you hadn't to go. Oh, it's just until Monday. Come and pick me up after work. But will you be all right, he said. And she said, well, why would I not be all right? He thought about her question. In fact, there were so many reasons. Of course, there was the war, which might bring death from the sky at any moment. And then there were orders, which could come quite arbitrarily, posting either of them to another city or to another country, where distance would begin to work its curse of transforming a lover's hand into handwriting. Then there were mechanical accidents. Machinery was well known to be full of spite for slim bodies such as the one he now clung to. Bearings lived to seize, axles to shear, cables to snap. Accidents of the heart were a worry too. She was beautiful. Other men could see this as well as he. She was bright and unconventional, and her faithfulness could not be assumed. There would come suitors who were taller or richer, or, most dreadful of all, who could make her laugh. How he feared men who could make her laugh. Next, there was disease. Less of a threat than good humour, but still not to be entirely discounted. Influenza came once in each generation and was overdue in theirs. Cancer or consumption might take her. A scratch on her finger might fester, a cold sore give ingress to a greater chill. Then there was a whole category of mishaps inseparable from physics. The tumble, the slip, and the choke. Collision, combustion, and shock. And he couldn't even begin to quantify the risks posed by third parties. Friends might queer her affections. Fiends in alleyways might murder her, or worse. Her parents, picking from a list of his faults, might seize on his pacifism or his poverty. They might set about dissuading their daughter, using all the tricks of their art. It wasn't a level playing field where parents were concerned. They had known her in every year of her life. He, not yet in every season of the year. Finally, there were the imponderables of memory and the psyche. She could wake up tomorrow with no recollection that she had ever known him. Or she could walk past a cafe and stop dead in her tracks, overcome by desire for the waiter. And worse than all of these things, because so much more likely were the mundane human dissatisfactions that absence would allow to incubate. What if he had said something to unsettle her? A single word could be enough, and she, brooding on it, came to decide that he did not truly love her. Or what if he had been unsatisfactory in bed? The more he thought about it, the more he worried that there was something he should have done, but had not. Or worse, something that he had done too much of. These were only the first thoughts that came. The more he considered it, the more causes there were for anxiety. Separation was air in the lungs of fate, and so when it was time for them to part after their first night together, and he asked her, "Will you be all right?" and she replied, "Why would I not be all right?" Well, in fact, so many reasons presented themselves that it immediately began to seem fantastically improbable, if he let go of her warm hand now and allowed her to walk away into this grey morning that smelled of spring, that they would ever see each other again. It seemed so much safer to stay close and to let the great disintegrating power of the world do its work on other lovers instead. But since he didn't know how to put all of this in a way that wouldn't seem pathetic, he simply said, "All right, I'll see you on Monday." It wasn't the same as charging down a machine gun nest armed only with a Bowie knife, or strapping into the tail gunner seat of a 4-engined heavy bomber. And no one else would ever know, since one didn't get a medal for letting go of a woman's hand on a grey Saturday morning in the middle of a European war. But to have faith that a lover would be constant and life clement, this did require courage in a city more disposed to beginnings than safe continuations. As she walked away from him, he turned his back, just to show that he could. For her part, Mary didn't find it at all difficult to walk away from Tom. She simply walked for a while, wearing yesterday's clothes. Yes, the war was a blind roulette. Yes, the city was full of beautiful women who might tempt him, some of them more thrilling than she was. A few already wearing summer dresses. It all weighed less heavily on her, since weightlessness was in her nature, and in any case, one simply had to live. Oh, and yet, "Darling," she called, spinning round. The crowd had taken him, though. She had imagined that he would still be standing there, watching her. But he wasn't, and now she felt a dreadful uncertainty about love. Thank you. Thank you so much. I think that's it from me. If you read the book, I really hope that you feel that you're there with these two young people and the cast that assemble around them, and that you really feel you've been through this experience and you've seen a war that we think we're very familiar with from a completely new angle that I've described. I really wanted it to be an immersive experience. If you do go through it, I really hope you'll enjoy it, because above everything else, I've never believed that reading ought to be a punishment. I really hope that you'll enjoy the book. Thank you very much. That's it from me. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you.